Hello and good evening. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm a professor here at the Journalism School and the director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. It's my honor to welcome you here tonight for this screening of and conversation about Armed with Only a Camera, The Life and Death of Brent Renaud, sponsored by the Lee Center and by the Overseas Press Club of America. On March 13th, 2022, Russian soldiers killed filmmaker Brent Renaud while he was reporting on the war in Ukraine. He was the first American journalist to die in Russia's war on Ukraine. His younger brother and collaborator, Craig Renaud, recovered Brent's body and his final recordings from Ukraine and brought them back to their childhood home in Arkansas. As Brent's journey to his final resting place unfolds, the film chronicles the years that he and his brother spent covering some of the world's most dangerous conflicts. Tonight's film encompasses so much about why we bear witness as journalists in war zones, the growing threats journalists face, particularly local journalists and freelance journalists who take great risks to do the work that they do, and what it means to center those who experience war firsthand in the stories that we tell. We're particularly lucky tonight to be joined by producer and filmmaker Juan Arredondo, who was with Craig on that fateful day and was also injured, as well as Lucy Westcott, Chief Emergencies Officer at the Committee to Protect Journalists, who will join me after the film for a conversation where you'll also be able to ask questions. So with that, please give us a hand for Armed Only with a Camera, The Life and Death of Brent Renaud. Hi all, thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you to both of you. Juan Arredondo is a Colombian-American filmmaker and photographer known for documenting human rights and social conflicts in Latin America and Ukraine. He frequently contributes to the New York Times and National Geographic. He's won a slew of awards, including the World Press Photo Award and a Peabody Award for his photography and documentary filmmaking work. He was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and holds a degree from Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, where he was briefly my student, but I don't consider him my student because he was already in class and publishing in the Times and was a stellar journalist. He teaches photojournalism and documentary filmmaking at Rutgers University. Lucy Westcott became director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Emergencies Department in October 2021. She oversees CPJ's assistance and safety work worldwide. She joined CPJ in 2018 as the James Foley Fellow. During her fellowship, she focused on safety issues for women journalists in non-hostile environments and assisted with the creation of safety resources for journalists globally. In 2021, she played a prominent role in CPJ's response to the Afghan crisis, including helping Afghan journalists and their families get evacuated. And she's a former journalist herself. So we're very lucky to be joined here tonight by both of them, not only to discuss some of the themes in this film and put it in some of the broader conflicts that are happening and the risks that many of you who will want to go on to do conflict reporting or to work as freelancers and can glean lessons learned both from the reporting that Juan and others in this film have done in the life of Brent, but also in the work that CPJ does. So Juan, I want to start with you, and thank you so much for making this very powerful film. At so many moments, I was like, Azmat, compose yourself, you cannot cry on stage. Sure, June, yeah, no problem. So I wanted to actually start with your relationship with Brent and how the two of you met and began working together, but also the values that both of you feel you shared.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sitting through the screening. It's a hard film to watch. So thank you, Azmat, for opening our space to discuss the film, remember Brent, and also to CPJ for being here and supporting us. So I met Brent when we were Nieman Fellows in 2018, 2019. I always tell the story that the first month of that fellowship, he would miss things. And in my mind, I was like, who misses events? Why is he showing up too late to the events, to the classes? And then later I learned, and then maybe a month into our fellowship, he called me up and he said, I lost the keys. I'm locked out of my apartment. Can I stay with you? So him and Chai came and stayed with me, and that's the kind of where our friendship started. He was very passionate about photography, thought he wasn't a good photographer, so he went into documentary filmmaking, and I always wanted to do documentary filmmaking, but I was a photographer, so I think it was a good marriage. Also, when Brent came to the Neiman that previous year, he had been in Somalia where he had been kidnapped and tortured. And so I think he needed a time off and a break. It was also a time where the brothers, Craig, decided to stay home, not go to the front lines or not go abroad. So I think it was a moment of transition for him. Later, we have the fellowship has something that's called a sounding. It's basically where you answer the question why you do what you do. And at that sounding, which is basically the blueprint for this documentary, is he revealing to the class that he was, later in his life as an adult, was diagnosed with autism. So, there were just things that got us to get along very well. I sort of became that bridge between maybe the not reading the social cues. He would miss events. I would call that he would be there. And so that's what forged that relationship. And then I decided to come to school and do the documentary track. And so Brent is like, well, come and stay and live with me in Brooklyn. And then halfway through that, and that was the year of the pandemic, very traumatizing. But halfway through the semester, he said, I have a project. When do you graduate? I want you to start working with us. And I think I was finishing up my thesis, and I was already shooting in Chicago, and just from that moment on, we started working together. So that was the common, I think their approach is very similar to my approach as a photojournalist, which is I like to spend a lot of time with my subjects. And so I think that it was a good marriage. Yeah.
You mentioned this, but it's not in the film very much. There's a mention of the fact that he was tortured in Somalia. What was behind the
they thought,
non-inclusion?
Yeah. So in Somalia, they thought, because the footage that you see, that was one of the first visits that he did. He went back to Somalia a second time. They thought he was a spy. That's why he was arrested. I think one night they came and tortured him just to see if he had anything to give to the government. And then at that point, the government, they call senators. The Renaud brothers are well known in Arkansas, so they have know some politicians, and so they basically kind of made a way to get him out. And then that was the end of that. What you see, that footage from Somalia, that was for a show for Discovery that I never made the air. Yeah.
I want to ask you, obviously you see incredible footage that Brent had worked on from so many different conflicts, and you see how physical it is. You can see, I think one of the opening scenes is he's wading through water, he's crossing through migrant channels. He is in war zones, he's in a tank. You can see him with soldiers and you see him with civilians across the board. He's somebody who very clearly had a lot of experience working in conflict zones, as do you. Can you walk everyone through sort of what happened that day and some of the calculations you made in Ukraine on the ground?
Sure. So briefly, we were doing a project for Time Studios, and this was a project was called Tipping Point, and we were supposed to do a series about the status of refugees around the world. So we first started in Greece, and then we went to Central America, and by the time we were set to go to Africa, the invasion of Ukraine started, and that was February 24th. So by October 8th or 7th is when we made the decision to go in. The numbers are already starting to swell. It went from 1 million to 2 million people being displaced, and we thought it would be important to document that at that moment. And They brothers have a lot of experience in conflict zones. We made sure we talked to people in the front lines, also in Ukraine. Because of our fellowship, we had 2 fellows that are Ukrainian, so they also give us some information, context in the ground. We already had a fixer, a driver, and a translator ready for us to connect with once we crossed the border. And we got insurance. We make sure we had the proper protective gear. But our goal was never to go to the front lines. That was very clear. We were not going to go to the east. And we weren't even sure if we were going to make it to Kiev. But when you get to Lviv, when we crossed the border from Poland to Lviv, it was a bottleneck. Everyone was trying to go across because at that point, early on, the invasion, European Union said that they were going to grant asylum for 3 years to all the Ukrainians. So that rushed people to go more to Poland as opposed to Belarus, Romania, which are sort of maybe proxies. I don't want to offend anyone, but maybe sort of proxies of Russian government. So people felt that the best way to go was to Poland. So the border was collapsed, and only elderly women and children were allowed to leave. All the men had to stay. And when we got to Lviv, it was clear that the story was coming more from the east, because everyone was coming in trains and buses from the east to the west. That took us, that week, maybe to get to, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Sitomir, which is about an hour away from Kiev. And that's where you see the footage of the old man, the house that got bombed. That's basically, he lived next to a hydro plant. We started to see that the Russian attacks were not very accurate. They were hitting a lot of civilian buildings. The woman that you see that is outside the apartment complex, that apartment complex was next to a military base. So it kept repeating itself. We would just go, we would hear the alarms. I don't know if you hear me saying, Brent, let's get out of here. That the first night that we got there to the city, they bombed a refinery. And then we heard another bombing, which is the older couple that we went to visit. So that just kept repeating, but we wanted to get the footage of the people being evacuated, and that took us to Kiev. We got there, I think, by March 10th. We quickly learned that Kiev had become a transit city. There were no shelters. Everyone was coming, put in trains or buses, and then taken to the west. But we kept hearing from people coming. You could clearly see caravans of civilian cars with flags, with graffiti on their car that said civilians or kids on board. But you would see bullet holes on their cars, and they would tell us that they got shot by Russians despite of them being civilians. And they kept mentioning Irpin and Bucha. We're coming from the north. Early on in the invasion, Russians tried to encircle Kiev and take the city. Ukrainians repelled that, and so Russians regrouped to the north, where you see in Irpin and Bucha. So we got on March 13, which was a Sunday. We said we just got to go there, see the evacuation, and then our goal is always to find a family or two that we can follow their journey from that point all the way to the border. And when we got to the border between Kiev, the outskirts of Kiev, and Irpin, there was this very famous bridge that was bombed, which I think you see some of the footage me being taken over a stretcher. That was purposely bombed so Russians would not come into Kiev. Not far from there is where Lindsay Dario almost was also killed. There was a bombing there. And so our car couldn't go any further. We got out. Our translator said he didn't want to go any further. In situations like that, you respect people's decisions. And Craig and I checked each other and said, let's go. We started walking. And it was going to be a long walk between where we got off the car to Irpin. Halfway, maybe walking, maybe half an hour into it, 3 cars approached us. We didn't speak Ukrainian. We have a translator. The cell signal was terrible. The last car, the driver spoke English. He said, what are you guys are doing and where you're trying to go? We explained, and still he offered to take us. The car was clearly said volunteers and civilians. We had our vests and our helmets. And 10 minutes into that drive is where I remember seeing from the corner of my eye 2 soldiers from a trench, and the one closer to the road, pull out a AK-47 and aim it at the car. So I just yelled, "We're getting shot!" And so I ducked behind the driver. And then that feels almost an hour, but it was very short. He made a U-turn, which put us in the crossfires. And all I remember is this barrage of bullets hitting the car. I could feel the broken glass on my face. And at one point, I felt this very sharp. It's like a punch. I can't describe it, but it was a very painful, and it was where I was shot in the glute. And so I remember I got shot, no one responded, and eventually the car broke down. And that's when I got up and I saw Brent with a big hole here in his neck. I tried to stop the bleeding. It was a 2-seater. It was a Lada, which is, if you know anything about Soviet Union, is a very common car that was used throughout the Soviet Union. So I had to wait for the driver to get around, open the door, hold Brent, me push the seat forward, and trying to get out. And by that point, I was losing a lot of blood. We laid Brent on the floor. And later I found out, because a year after this, I went back and I met the driver. And he told me that the logic there was every 15 minutes there would be a relay. So he thought worst case scenario, we would wait 15 minutes. Luckily, 5 minutes after a car came, he waved the car down and they put me in that car. So I actually don't watch the film anymore, because there's a photograph that one of the soldiers took of Brent, and that's the last image I saw of him. So I'm trying not to remember him by that image. And then after that, it was just me getting to the bridge, fainting, waking up in an ambulance, and the first thing I did was call Craig, which you hear him talk about that phone call. And then I was taken to a hospital. That hospital was one of the largest child pediatric hospitals in Kiev. And when I got there is when someone, and later I learned she was the PR person, she interviewed me, and that was the video that became viral. And at that point, I was just basically at the hands of the doctors. I was lucky there were 3 doctors there from Doctors Without Borders. They were there to train the medical staff for this kind of trauma. So now we make fun, but I was sort of the guinea pig of how are you supposed to do some things. And then that was on a Sunday. There was a Fox crew who was bombed, and I think only one person survived on Monday. And on Tuesday, the Doctors Without Borders got intel that they were going to bomb the city again, and possibly the hospital. So they asked me if I wanted to be evacuated, and so I said yes. It was a 12-hour train ride where they also learned how to put a stretcher on a train. There was nothing to connect the IV, so the women in the train helped us to put my IV. That moment is where I think for me it clicked that now it was part of their story and not behind the lens. And and then after that it's just, I can go on and on and on. It's just another movie. It's another story.
Yeah. It's really harrowing to witness what's in this film, to hear you talk about it. But I want to pull out some themes and then bring it to Lucy. But the questions of safety and journalists and preparation, and you are all clearly people who've been deeply trained. You're freelancers who are very experienced, and in these scenarios you're faced with decisions. Do we, our translator's not going to come with us, do we go by foot? Does the car turn around? And there's just I wanted the audience to really hear that very complicated set of decisions that you had to make, and I think the really devastating choices, that these growing risks. You mentioned the Fox News crew. To my understanding, and Lucy, I'd love for you to give us some context and data, CPJ has tracked as many as 17 journalists killed in the war in Ukraine, and and there is a great deal of rising threats around the world. Can you talk more about what we've seen specifically in Ukraine, and also the breakdowns when it comes to local journalists and freelancers, and who we're seeing being killed in these numbers?
Yes, thank you. So the latest data for Ukraine, we put that number of journalists killed in Ukraine at least 20. And just last month, a French photojournalist was killed by I believe, a Russian drone, followed a few days later by 2 Ukrainian journalists, again by a drone. So there's a pattern that we're seeing there, and we're investigating further. And then a German TV crew were similarly attacked by a Russian drone. So all of this is to say that Ukraine is a protracted crisis, one of many around the world, in which local journalists are disproportionately affected. You mentioned the Fox News crew. Included in that crew was a local producer who lost her life in that attack as well. It's mentioned in the film, and actually I realize I've got my clicker here, so I'm going to go very quickly. This is a QR code that will take you to CPJ's journalist safety information. And for those of you who want to know more and want to see the type of guidance that we provide, I think this is a very useful. I'll leave that up for a minute. We saw in the film that journalism is one of the world's most dangerous professions. It's becoming one of the world's most dangerous professions. And our data shows that there has really never been a more dangerous time to be a journalist than now. I'm going to go to this slide as well, which has some of our data that proves this. So in 2025, at least 112 journalists and media workers were killed worldwide. As of November 7th this year, 326 journalists are behind bars worldwide, and that is a near record number. And then again, we go back to the Russia's full-scale invasion, at least 20 journalists and media workers killed, and 10 journalists and media workers in prison as well. So the situation, unfortunately, is not improved.
And when we're looking at these rising threats, they've gone much higher in the last several years. Can you talk about the war in Gaza, which has been devastating, and the war in Sudan, and what we're seeing in terms of journalists killed in both of those conflicts?
Yes, I can. So our current numbers for the war in Gaza put the number of journalists at nearly 200 journalists killed in that war, which is very, very difficult to understand. It's an enormous number of journalists, and they are local journalists there who are the ones telling their story. Because there is no international independent access to Gaza, they are the only ones that can really tell that story. And every journalist that is killed, that is, the flow of information and our ability as the public to know what is going on has been severely curtailed. While there is a ceasefire in place right now, that unfortunately does not mean that it's really any safer for journalists in Gaza. CPJ reporting shows that photojournalists and others have been killed since the ceasefire. They continue to be harmed. Journalists have to rebuild their lives as well, and we at CPJ hope to assist in that in some way. Of course, Gaza is not the only conflict that is going on, and I want to just say a little bit about Sudan as well, which, given all the atrocities going on internationally, I think doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. Dozens of journalists killed in that conflict as well. The added horror of sexual violence against female journalists in particular. And I would direct you to cpj.org for a recent report on that topic as well.
So when we're seeing these risks, we're talking about physical safety to life, we're talking about imprisonment, we're also thinking about emotional risk, trauma, PTSD as well. I know that there are so many lasting and enduring, and you even referred to it yourself in talking about the ways in which Brent changed after Somalia. Can you describe some of your own experiences in training for this, thinking through taking care of yourself, not just preparing before a trip, but for your safety, but also thinking about your mental health, and then Lucy, I'd love to turn to you after that and to learn more about CPJ's resources on the same subject.
Sure, thank you, Azmat, for that question. So I know, for example, for Brent, he had a very severe case of PTSD. When we were in Ukraine, that's the highest that I seen it. So we used to we'll always share a room, and I think that week leading up to our incident, he will wake up in the middle of the night just saying they're coming, they're coming and coming. He will wake me up, and he would either go to the window, and then he will wake up, and I will try to calm him down. But the next day we won't talk about it. So there is that part of journalism or journalists who choose maybe not to talk about their trauma. For me, I think the hardest part was the survivor guilt, feeling that I was a very bad or shitty friend for leaving my friend behind. And that's when your mind starts playing this movie of the what ifs. What if we have woken up later that day? What if I told him not to go? What if the car broke down? What if we just didn't go for that footage? And then you go if. To me, the hardest part was also, his family. They wanted answers, some answers that I didn't have. I later learned, after a lot of therapy, that your brain chooses to shut some memories to protect itself. So I had batches, I had holes, and your mind fills those holes with perhaps not the right information. Brent's money, camera, and personal wallet and cell phone disappeared. So in my mind, I thought someone came and mugged him. Well, I laid him on the floor. And I always felt guilty for that. Therapy works very differently for many people. I felt that when I was first starting, it was very clinical. It didn't help me because I was just filling out a questionnaire every week. We would go over the questions, and then the next week, we will do it again. And I felt I was left with all these feelings, but not one to talk to. So I would talk to Craig, who, understandably, he was mourning the loss of his brother. So at that point, it's hard because what I did is I isolated myself. I didn't want to be remembered as the guy who survived. Oh, is that what happened to you? And I didn't want to dump all of this on someone else. So I don't want to say it's natural, but what I did is I sort of hid myself, I retrieved myself from friends, isolated, because I just felt like I didn't want to dump this on anybody. I later found a therapist who had worked with veterans. That was very helpful. I think for me, the most helpful has been to talk to other journalists who've gone through this. So I was fortunate to be friends with Brent Renaud, who was an amazing photojournalist, but he was a doctor in the South African Army. And he, told me there's a bunch of checklists that has to happen for you to save Brent or save yourself. David Goodenfeld, who now shoots for the Times, had also had a terrible experience in Africa. Michael Christopher Brown, who was injured in Libya. So all these photojournalists, I reach out to them, and there's a community out there. So that's all to say that there are some of us, there's a community that can embrace you. We tend to forget that. And so I think that's part of the trauma of dealing with those kind of things. But I feel like I'm in a better place now.
Thank you for sharing that. And just a quick note, we're going to open this up to questions in just a little bit. So there is a mic here if you want to line up behind the mic to ask a question. Please feel free to do so. Lucy, tell us a little bit about CPJ's resources for journalists in distress and those who might be experiencing trauma.
Yes. So just a point as well that the CPJ Emergencies team, which is the part of CPJ that I'm lucky enough to run, was actually created in response to the terrible murder of American freelance journalists Stephen Sotloff and James Foley back in 2014. And we were really created to fill a gap and to solve a problem that was happening then, which was freelance journalists were being sent into incredibly dangerous situations that news organizations would often say, well, it's too dangerous for my staff, but I'll let a freelancer go. I believe, or I'd like to believe, that attitude has improved, and there are far more protections for freelancers now. But just to say that we are very much grounded in the dangers of conflict reporting for freelance journalists as well. And when we created the Emergencies team, we really want to view journalist safety as this kind of trifecta, right? So we've talked about physical safety. We're also talking about digital safety. So for journalists, that's often digital harassment, online attacks against you, often targeted attacks, and that can very much overlap with your physical safety, and what's offline can very much, what's online can very much become offline. Included in that, the third piece is what we call psychosocial safety, which often extends into trauma as well. So one of the ways that CPJ can support journalists is through financial assistance and financial grants. And these are for journalists in distress, facing emergency situations. And just to illustrate the need, when I started at CPJ back in 2018, we had a $250,000 budget to help journalists all over the world with individual grants for things like exile support, trauma support, which I'll talk about, legal support, medical support as well. And that's now $1 million a year. And all of that money goes to journalists who need various types of assistance. Trauma support really means we can cover the cost of therapy fees. It's really great, Juan, to hear that you found a practitioner who understood what you were talking about, because one of the things we hear a lot is, oh, well, I'm a journalist and I see a therapist, but they'll ask me why I went to that dangerous protest, or they'll ask me why I put myself in that position, and it's because it's your job and you want to be there. And so there are some efforts being made. There's a really great resource called the Journalist Trauma Support Network, which I would encourage folks to check out. They train trauma-informed therapists on issues that journalists face, so there can be better care for those journalists too.
And while this is happening, I want to be, for full disclosure, and because CPJ was very helpful, when I was injured, I couldn't feel my leg for 2 months, so I didn't know if I was going to walk again. So the emergency financial assistance, what they did is they provided me for 3 months' salary, and that was extremely helpful because I know I had that support and that help. So there are resources out there, and so yeah, please check them out.
Juan, I want to talk about being a freelancer in that situation and insurance and the experience that occurred for Brent, and things that, so often there might be resources. When you're a freelancer, there might be resources where you can buy a certain kind of insurance. It's very expensive. Can you talk a little bit, because I know sort of some of the ramifications of what happened on the ground. Can you describe what the situation was for Brent and his family when it came to that freelancer insurance?
Sure. So we both got insurance for freelancers. Brent was killed between 12:30 and 1 p.m. of that Sunday. His insurance expired at noon. So the insurance company did not compensate for that. The family tried to negotiate, tell him it didn't go very well, so it was a lawsuit. It didn't go anywhere. But that's all to say that I think we're at the mercy of these insurance companies. I don't know much about insurance other than my healthcare. That's as far as my knowledge of it. But there are some resources. I think even reading the fine print, you assume that you're buying the best resource and the best insurance for us. I was lucky because Columbia stepped in and helped me. And so, yeah, for freelancers, at least when I was starting as a photojournalist, it's very common practice that we go to these places to make a name for ourselves. Sometimes you don't get an assignment by someone unless you're in that location. And then at that point is they'll hire you. No questions asked, just get the work done. And it's up to us to pay for protective services, to be able to pay for all the expenses that require to be in the field. but also often that is not spoken as this insurance. So for us, that was for the family, it was a terrible experience. They had to pay obviously for everything, for the funeral, for Brent to go in and taking out his brothers. Delta and KLM gave him, they honor Brent by not charging them for the flights. But yeah, that's all, it starts to add up. If you think about, like, if I had to pay for all the treatment that I have. Ukrainian doctors did not charge anything. They said it was an honor for them to treat me, which they didn't have to. I was a foreigner. But in the moment, they just felt, no, we'll take care of you. So I'm just lucky to be alive and to be here. So I don't know if that would be another case. If I would do that way, I would have to make sure I got the right insurance, and but yeah, you're at the mercy of some companies.
And please start to line up with your questions. Do you approach risk differently now, or assignments differently?
I think there's been now that I shoot more for the Times, I think there has been a shift. Now there is a security committee who you have to check. Actually, 4 months after I recover, I had an assignment where I had to go back to Colombia, and to me that was sort of a big change because there was a whole security team making sure I was there.
Yeah, the Colombia, the
South
country.
America, Colombia, the country, not the university. Oh,
it's dicey here.
yeah, it's dicey too. 2 years ago, I probably would have needed that, but security. But yeah, and so you get a GPS tracker. Someone's watching you 24/7. You have to check in the morning. You have to check at night. It's all fully covered. So I feel that maybe some newsrooms are changing. In the case for us as freelancers like Craig and I, who are freelancers and filmmakers, we have to take care of our own. So we do now measure a little bit more of the risk. There's always a risk assessment. There's always a percentage of risk in this job. Going for what Lucy said on the therapist, it's like asking a fireman, why are you a firefighter? Why you are running towards the fire? Like, that's just, you don't ask that. That's a calling. This is our passion. This is our job. And so that is always a risk that we go to play. For example, we were at the mercy of the driver that instead of going straight, he made a U-turn. Do we blame him? No. It was a decision he made. I later found out that in his mind, he was military before, and he thought, if I drive and these people are captured by the Russians, most likely they will be kidnapped and tortured. So he knew the area well, so he took that risk. So you're at that mercy of that risk. And unfortunately for us, it was Brent dying.
And I don't think I need to remind this crowd because I know you so well, but a question is a question, and I think we will get some great ones. So thank you.
You might have to turn it on. Yep. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a
Sarah.
recent grad. I guess it's a very practical question, but when looking at freelance insurance, I mean, even with healthcare, you have to compare, and I was wondering if you guys knew of any resources that kind of made recommendations for different situations, different insurance, or what one insurance is better at versus the other.
Don't want to be the insurance expert here, but I would highly recommend, and I can talk to you after this, looking up something called the ACOS Alliance. So that's ACOS. It stands for A Culture of Safety Alliance. Again, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the ACOS Alliance, but they are a fantastic organization dedicated to freelance safety. And again, an organization that came about following the terrible deaths of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff. They have a whole section on their website about insurance. They can also answer questions about insurance. So I would suggest that be your first port of call. And one, asking other freelancers maybe what they've used, to your point about speaking to other journalists about how you feel, and that using that community of freelancers is a good bet too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oops. Short height. Okay. I don't know. Oh, okay. Hi,
Hello.
I'm Sneha Srisaika. I'm from the School of International and Public Affairs. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I don't have many words to describe, but
Oh,
I'm
thank
just
you.
really grateful to you for sharing this work with
Thank you.
us. So, I just want to understand, like, when you're in these conflict-ridden spaces, people are very wary of foreigners. They, that is what I assume, at least, that, when they are, attacked always, or when they are mentally and physically at a place of unrest, how do you ensure that as foreigners you are there to really just understand their point of view or understand what's going on? How do you sort of approach that?
Great question. So I think part of it is learning as much as you can about the culture, learning as much about the conflict, so you don't parachute and just be clueless of what is happening. A common practice that I do is I always ask the people that I'm with, is this the story? What is the issue? I think I find myself as in the middleman, almost like a translator between my editors and what the story is. They have a conception of what the story should look like or what we should go after, but I'm that bridge to what the people on the ground are telling me. And sometimes I push back to my editors and say, I don't think that's the story, this is it. There's some negotiation there. But I think for us, it's always been about listening to the people. We always go with someone who has good knowledge of the culture and who understands and opens doors for us as fixers, as activists, or people that you find on the ground that can help you connect with people. And sometimes there's stories that I feel that I shouldn't be the one going to do that story because I don't have any context. Or, for example, in the Middle East, I have no business being there as a man, doing a story on women's rights, reproductive rights, or anything like that. So I'm always cautious of checking myself if I should be that person. Always asking my editor, are you sure I should go? Yeah, okay, but maybe. And if I am, then I make sure I do my homework. So I think that's something that I always try. And I have my share of embarrassments where I say I was in Bangladesh in the summer and I kept, as a Colombian, we touch a lot. Oh, I couldn't do that. And quickly someone told me I shouldn't do that. But those are things that you have to learn in the field. You have to be very respectful. I think the way you carry yourself and you treat people, people can read that. If you're an asshole, people can read that from miles away. But if you spend the time to listen, I think the best advice I got was, and I'm sorry for cursing, but is learn how to shut the fuck up. Like, just shut up and listen. A lot of times we want to talk about the reporter. Brent was great at that. I just not talking at all. And that's why you get to see that scene in Iraq, or you get to see some of these scenes, is because we would just let the action unfold and the people kind of hold our hand to tell their story. So that takes practice, but I think part of it is, so going with humility. Azmat can also speak a lot about that experience in the field, but that's what I can share.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Perfect. My name is Jordan, and I am a sophomore at Fordham University. And my question for you is, from the clips that I saw, you guys both did just an incredible job getting people to feel comfortable with you. And I guess this question kind of piggies back off of the previous one, but how do you get people to feel comfortable with you in such horrifying situations to where, you're able to come up with them with the camera and they're so willing to talk to you? How do you approach them? And I guess, how do you ask them if they're willing to talk to you, especially as a foreigner?
Sure. Am I the only one answering these questions?
I'm happy to help, but why don't you go first?
Sure. Okay, please. Okay. So, if anything I've learned from being in these places is that you can see the worst in people and the best in people. And I think people really connect when they see you coming from wherever you're coming from, giving your time to listen to them and to learn about their stories. That people really resonates with them. They appreciate it. They're grateful. And and to me, that's always been just spending time with people. It's a luxury that we all don't have. We don't have, but I like to come back to the story. In situations like this, it's hard, but there's just ways of how you compose yourself, how you treat people, how you listen to them. Just a simple gaze or a gesture might signal that they're not comfortable, and you have to be respectful. That's at least a little bit of the practices that I do, but people are very grateful and that you're there. And sometimes, and I felt that when I was injured, that people came up to me and said, well, thank you for coming to my country and for doing our stories. And I felt so, I don't know, so little, because I was like, but I'm not doing anything, now I'm injured, I should have been doing more. Anyway, that's another story. I don't know.
That's really helpful. And yes, I think that when I am door knocking here in the United States and I'm going to somebody's home, I actually find it a lot harder than most of the places that I report abroad. My work focuses on civilian casualties, largely from airstrikes in places like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, the West Bank, not on the ground, but remotely with people in Gaza. And in all of these places, so often people are dying to tell their stories. And what they really want is somebody who will listen and somebody who will sit with them. And, I have a sort of approach to those interviews where, you go through certain mechanisms. I have standard sort of things I say up front to get not just informed consent, but meaningful consent. So, I tell them who I am and what it is that I'm doing, where, if they choose to talk to me, their face or words might appear, and what issues that might pose for them. I have usually like a disclaimer, which is like, because remember, not everyone is super media literate. They don't know what off the record means, or they don't know that they can ask to go on background. And I'll say like, listen, I'm going to, I'd like to ask you some questions, but you don't have to answer any of these questions, because in most of these places where I report, there's a really strong culture of guest rights. So people are very welcoming. They invite you into their home. They will serve you a meal, even if they don't have a great deal of money. Like, there is such a culture of hospitality. And so I'm very like hyper aware in many of these places that I don't want to take advantage of that. And I want them to know, if I ask anything that is offensive, I want you to know I didn't intend it. And so, I go through these kinds of things. And then, this interview itself, similarly, STFU, where you're listening to people's answers and you're taking in what they're saying. And what I've often found is not that, yes, there are people who have been burnt by the media and maybe don't trust journalists. And with that demographic of people, it's really just about like listening and sitting and being patient. But most of the time, I would say like 98% of people I speak to have never spoken to a journalist before. They're dying to tell their story, and I'll sit with them for 3 hours. And, as the interview ends, like there was just this mother in Tulkarem in the West Bank who lost her son and nephews in an Israeli airstrike. And I was sitting with her and I did this long interview. I think I was at her house for 3 hours, and we're wrapping up and I'm about to leave. And she tells me about her son's love story and about, this fiance he had had and the drama between them. And it kept going. And I remember thinking like, I don't think she wants me to report any of this. She just wants someone to know, my son who died too young, he had a love story too. He lived. And that has been my experience with so many survivors of trauma, is that they are so eager to share their stories. And it's usually the kind of flip, they're people who want so badly to reach an audience and to be heard and to be reflected with dignity and meaning. And I think that's what the purpose of this work is.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Hi. Is there time for one more question?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm a former student of Professor Khan's.
Thank you.
And my question's mostly about, actually it's directed to both of you, about how your work has changed as a journalist since this horrific incident and murder of your friend, and also wondering if that risk calculation is has changed recently with the trending data that CPJ had on the screen recently, and if that's widespread, if there's any like pattern there.
Okay. No, thank you for that question. So, I mean, my practices have not. I've been, if best, I'm more informed, more cautious. That is not to say, for example, that I wouldn't go back to covering some of the issues that I normally cover. I don't consider myself a conflict photographer or war correspondent because of work, and I guess the topics that I was covering, I ended up covering some of that. So these days I find myself here at home, which that's not to say that we are also at risk. But it's more calculated risks. It's should we go? We covered that protest. Should we go and we're sort of bracing to see what happens here in New York with the National Guard. But things like that, like you have a conversation with your editor. I'm also trying to think: do I want to do that? Should I need to be exposed to that? Am I adding to the white noise, or am I actually doing some different reporting? So I am more cautious of that, but that doesn't mean I won't cover other conflicts. And it's I feel like this is like a muscle that you start to exercise it more and more. And obviously, I'm not going to go to every conflict in the world just because I need to flex my muscles and get more memory trained. But I will, I'll take more precautions. If I go back to Colombia, there are other practices that you do. Different countries operate very differently. Crime operates very differently. Authorities operate very differently. So I'm always, if I'm going to go back to Latin America, I make sure I know beforehand. And this is talking to other fellow reporters and saying, hey, how things are looking in Mexico these days and then they'll say, no, it's safe. Maybe you shouldn't be in these areas. And so there's a network there that I try to reach out to before I do make any decisions. Yeah.
And I'll just add, so while we had the data there on journalists who have been killed and imprisoned, there's a lot that wasn't captured there. And that's a general trend we're seeing of the crackdown on the media legally in many, many parts of the world. Another piece there is an enormous trend that CPJ and other organizations like us are working on, which is the number of journalists who are forced into exile. So they're not necessarily fleeing from active conflict zones, although that absolutely does and continues to happen. We're talking about journalists who are living in repressive regimes, countries where their fellow journalists have been killed and they believe they're at risk and they leave. Communities of journalists who come here to the United States, they take very complicated journeys to come here because they are fleeing for their safety. And so that is a trend that we do not expect to stop or decline anytime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your sharing.
Thank you.
I'm very curious on how you find, for example, the driver or the translator with you when you are out in the field to work for you. What's that relationship?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So what happened was when I was evacuated, the driver was also injured. He had shrapnel in his back, so he was taken to a hospital. A couple of days later, President Zelensky went to that hospital, and so the driver introduced himself to the president, told him who he was and who he was driving. Someone in the team got his contact, and so we were looking at the film, when we were trying to make the film, I went back to do that. Obviously didn't make this film, but I went back and I traveled and I revisited the road that we took. So we reached out to the presidency there, and then they gave us his contact, and he was willing to speak to me. So that's how I connected with that driver. But our fixer, Sasha, and translator, Sasha, and Irina, they're safe. Now they're not there anymore. They're in Poland. I think Irina's now in London. So they were there. They were actually Sasha was a film student who knew very well English, but because he couldn't leave the country, it sort of became a way of him helping and making some money, and so he became a translator for that. So that actually you'll find often in some conflict areas where people that are media savvy or students or journalists help other journalists and help them navigate. Yeah.
Also, you met them when you were there instead of...
Yes, we met them when we met there. So before going there, we had friends who made sure we were in contact with a couple of them. It's not an interview, but we check with them and see what experience they had, if they were comfortable with going to certain areas. We always want people to, ideally someone who has worked with other journalists before, for many reasons. One is knowing how the work is done, for example, knowing that we can extend in hours, also being very resourceful. At times, sometimes the story can take another direction, and fixer drivers can be extremely helpful to keep an eye on not only safety, but also to let you know, hey, some things are changing in the field. We got to move quickly, or I think there's another developing story going on. So that's how you connect to people in the ground. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendation for like first time, like when you don't know like anyone, like how to?
Are you a journalist right now? Are you at CJS? Are you at the journalism school?
No, but like aspiring.
You're okay, no problem. I was just checking because I was going to recommend classes where we get into this in deep ways. But I will say that there's a few things. There's a Facebook group that a lot of people who work in conflict zones, and I can tell you about that after this. It's like a private Facebook group that a lot of reporters use to do research about who to work with and which places. It's a lot of people who work in, as journalists, as aid workers, as other things, but there's a whole process because we don't just leap out and jump into it. There's a whole process and checklist, and so I can share resources with you from some of my own curriculum and help you further with that for sure. So thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm a graduate from the climate school, but I guess the more relevant information is that I'm from Turkey, which is like not a great place to be a journalist. So I guess my question is more for the community to protect journalists, because I think as a kid, like I was always interested in journalism, but I'm like, okay, I'm from Turkey, like I might end up in jail, so I didn't go that route. And so I was wondering, beyond following the trends, especially considering that like now there's like a more and more global trend of like democratic backsliding, and it's like really hard to report from your own country, even if it's not a war zone. It's just like people end up in jail, and then there's like you go into exile and everything. So I was wondering, are you guys working on something to like help those journalists, or like kind of a plan?
Yes. Thank you for your question. So Turkey is regularly one of the top 10 countries. I believe for many years it was the top country for journalists jailed around the world, and unfortunately that trend continues. CPJ, in our office, we have a wall of journalists who are in prison. And the journalist who's on that wall who has been in prison for the longest is a woman named Hatis Duman, who's been in prison in Turkey since 2003. Turkey is an interesting country because it is both an unsafe place for its own journalists, as well as being a safe haven for many journalists from other parts of the world. So you have, it's complicated. It's not the only country like that as well, but it is one that we pay close attention to. So we know of communities of journalists from Syria, from Iraq, Afghanistan as well, who all try and make their own life there while their Turkish colleagues are facing jail time, crackdowns, surveillance, raiding of their homes, and threats against them and their families. So while there is no kind of concrete plan, we keep a very, very close eye on Turkey, and we advocate on behalf of those journalists and try and at least raise awareness and make it safer for them.
And I would also, I can introduce you to one of our colleagues here at the J School, a professor named Aida Alami, who is from Morocco, was born and raised there, has faced unique threats in the country, and then has really sought out this global reporting career. And I think she would have some really interesting thoughts for you specifically on how she has personally navigated that and the reporting she's had to do as a result. And I would also just add that, we have a lot of journalists who come from places like, for example, China, and they want to do great investigative reporting there, and they do, but they will often use an anonymous byline. And they might reach sources and be abroad and use a pen name. And there's there are approaches that one can take to try to mitigate to mitigate threats, and to think through, well, I come from this place, but I may not be able to be very open about this, or maybe I'd like to take a different approach, and happy to help strategize and think through that. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
I could keep asking you questions, for hours, but I want to just kind of draw back for 1 second and sort of distill, I think, some of the themes that have come up tonight. We've been talking a lot about freelancers, about local journalists, about the rising threats for journalists globally. I would argue we've never seen, and I think this is reflected in the data, it's reflected in what CPJ has been putting out as well, is that we have yet to seen such incursions on press freedom, on the life and physical safety of journalists as we've seen in recent years, and in the last 2 years in particular. And I wanted to leave each of you with parting words for the future of journalists. I wanted each of you to give parting words to these aspiring reporters, emerging journalists, people who've already been working in these war zones, as you think about those threats, and maybe a mantra or encouragement for their approach going forward.
So I think being a journalist is the best job in the world. And while I do not get to do kind of the daily reporting I used to do, it is a privilege to be a journalist and to be able to meet everyone you meet and tell their story. And the very difficult data, what we saw in the film, I hope that only encourages people to go out and follow their dream, and being a journalist is indeed a calling, and know that there is a whole ecosystem of support out there for you, and that begins with CPJ, but we are more than happy to help you try and stay safe. So please come to us and ask us all the questions you need.
I think the one thing I would say is, we need you more now than ever. The country needs you more now than ever. I feel this is a way of us resisting and pushing back to the powers that be. I come from a country who obviously have a long share animosity with the press. Latin America is in this tide of authoritarian governments. And truth hurts, truth goes in counter to that. So don't back down, keep doing what you're doing, be brave, and know that there's a whole ecosystem, there are professors, there are colleagues, there's people who you're reaching out for help. You're not alone, but please let's not give up the fight. We just have to keep doing our work.
Juan, thank you so much for sharing this incredibly powerful and intimate film. And thank you, Lucy, for all of this. Let's please give them a big round of applause.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.